So we'll take a different, this afternoon takes a different approach completely. Now we're into the practical side of things. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Jürg von Känel from IBM Australia in the research area, where he's the Associate Director of the IBM Research Centre in Australia, in Melbourne. And he flew here 3 times last night. He flew in just as the storms hit Sydney, and they thought it's probably best not to run out of fuel. So they flew him back to Melbourne to collect some fuel. And then they turned around again and came back here to Sydney. So top marks for persistence. He studied maths and computer science at Zurich, and he holds a PhD in computer science. He joined IBM in 1985 in Zurich, and in 1991 he moved to the T.J. Watson Research Center in the US and managed the relationship between research and financial services industries. In 2004, he initiated an enterprise risk and compliance framework focused primarily on the financial industry. This led to the Treasury and Risk magazine listing him as one of the 100 most influential people in finance in 2006. Since 2011, he came to Melbourne to lead the establishment of a new IBM research lab in Australia. In his scarce spare time, he and his wife invent, design, and make mechanical puzzles. And I've got a challenge for him after the talk. I'm not certain 100% what the name Jürg means, but I think it's the Dutch-German-Russian form of George, and which in turn is derived from the Greek word Georgios, that means farmer or earth worker. So, over to you, Jürg.
So yes, I'm the black sheep in the family. I studied computer science. Most others are farmers or earth workers. I did spend all my summers when I grew up on my grandfather's Alp in the Swiss Alps, so I do have a bit of that as a background. So, Watson, you probably all heard about 2011 when we built the supercomputer. Who could play the game of Jeopardy and win? I'm going to take you a little bit through what is this cognitive computing? Why are we so excited about this in IBM? Why are we shifting our business around it? And how did we get there? Talk a little bit about what it took to win Jeopardy. And then from there, research prototype, cool game to play. How did we move that into commercialization? And there's still a large amount of stuff which the Watson system can't do yet. So there's a lot of research left over, and I'm going to talk a bit about that as well. We look at 3 eras of computing. It all started in the late 1800s, early 1900s with tabulating machines, computers which essentially could sort and count. In the late 40s, early 50s, that changed with the introduction of generally programming computing systems. And almost all computers today still are from that era. There's a bit of a problem with that. One of the things is, well, they can calculate stuff. They're not really good at answering questions. And most people have questions. So how do you build a machine which can answer questions? That was one of the reasons why we went after Jeopardy. The other reason was there was a report from Manpower who carefully tracks how many of what skills the universities produce and how many of what skills the industry needs. And in 2006, there was a report which says in the US, the schools only produce 50% of computer scientists and programmers as needed by the industry. And so everybody thought, it's not going to be a problem. We're just outsourcing it to India. Well, the same report says India will have the same problem in 2014, aka now. And so we started to say we need to find computers which actually can learn. We will not be able to have enough people in the world to keep programming the way we're programming computers. So that's why we call this the new era of computing. These eras last about 50 years, so we're just barely into it. When we started at this, one of the big questions we often ask in IBM research, does the world know we're good at something? And often the question is, well, academia knows. We're winning some awards somewhere. But how does the world know? We call these grand challenges when we can formulate a hard-to-solve problem, and we can say, if we can solve it in this manner, the world will notice, and the world will understand that we actually made progress. We were fairly good at question answering at the time, and we won lots of academic awards. And at some point we realized nobody knows. And we started to analyze, what would it take to be known? And someone said, well, we need to win Jeopardy. Then everybody knows. Now, Jeopardy in itself is kind of a weird thing because everybody in TV land knows question answering games are boring. You can't have a game show where you answer questions. And nobody could explain why Jeopardy survived so long, except they're kind of playing it reverse, right? They give you a clue, aka the answer to which you have to answer with the question. So it's convoluted on top of everything else. And so we said, well, what's it take to get there? And we analyzed, where is question answering at? And you see that brown line at the bottom? To win academic competitions, you had to answer about 50% of the questions, about 20% right. Then we analyzed, what does it take to win Jeopardy? And you see all these dots at the top of the chart. Every of these dots represents a winner. In general, you have to answer 50% of the questions 90% right. And if you want to be a grand champion, you have to answer 70% of the questions 90% right. Kind of a big jump. So we put a program in place, and like any company with measurements, and every 6 months the research team had to show progress. And so we started out, the first jumps were not that hard. But as we progressed, the increments became smaller and smaller. And obviously along the way, there were a lot of humorous things. If you ever search YouTube for some of the early versions of Watson, where he couldn't distinguish between men and women and other kinds of things, you find some really humorous answers from those times. But by the end of 2010, we were playing consistently in the winner's cloud. Now, you can't just walk up to Jeopardy and say, we have a computer, it's playing Jeopardy, right? They got ratings at stake, and you can't just go to Jeopardy and say, I'm good, get me on the show. Actually, as a human, you have to go through about 50 pre-trials before they let you for the real game. So when we talk to the Jeopardy folks, well before that, they kind of say, well, we're not letting you just on the show. But we'll give you all the pre-trial games, and why don't you have at it? And so they started to track this, and so when they saw where we were at the end of 2010, they said, okay, so we'll put it on. And it was scheduled for February of 2011, a three-game match. Now, so the story goes, the team who actually built Jeopardy went to our boss the night before the games and said, we got 2 settings on Watson. We can set it to guarantee second place winning, or we can tilt the lever to go for broke, and we may win. Well, so the boss decided we go for broke. Well, who wants to be second place? And for those of you who happen to have seen or some of the reruns, know that it was by no means just an easy win. We had a number of questions which we answered wrongly. during the game, and it was actually quite contested, going up and down and back and forth, playing against the two grand champions of Jeopardy. Now, part of the things which you think would be easy for a computer, right? You all know Jeopardy. The question gets read, you press the buzzer. Whoever presses it first gets to put up the answer. Now, computers are fast, right? They can press buttons really fast. You can build solenoids about 300 milliseconds. The problem is, it takes 300 milliseconds to press that button for a computer. Humans are much, much faster because they can anticipate. The game master reads the question. When he's done reading the question, the gate gets unlocked. The computer has no anticipation. Some of these grandmasters have nanosecond response time because they're so good at anticipating. So that was actually a little bit of an Achilles heel for us. We were not the fastest button presser, interestingly enough. So, great. We won the game. We showed that we can build a computer which can answer really, really convoluted English hints with answers. How do you get there? Part of the thing is, when we got all the data from Jeopardy, well, you could build a rule system. But turns out, at most, for a single category, questions over the year repeated only about, or were in the same category for 3%. It would have taken a humongous rule system to even get close. And what do you do about certain things? You think, yeah, why don't we hard code the month's name? There's only 12, or the week name. But that's a problem. What do you do if a question about Ramadan comes along? Well, that's a month's name, kind of. And so on and so forth. So we put a rule in which says everything has to be learned. And so we built this massive learning system which can ingest all that information in and get back. One of the things which a lot of people thought, what was all this learning and stuff? It's like all the humans. Wouldn't it be easier for a computer if you were connected to the internet and you could just search the answer? Well, it turns out searches are actually quite long, and you only got about 3 seconds to grasp the question and to find the answer. So what a lot of people thought was actually a real big problem for us, that we weren't allowed to be connected to the internet, turned out to not really be a problem. Because it would take much longer to get out and find the question answered out there than it was from the learned system. So how do we do this? The question comes in. We got all these facts which we pre-learned, and now you have to generate an answer. One of the hardest things to give up on was one of the fundamental kind of almost laws of computer science. It's not really taught, but it underlies our thinking, almost like a dogma. You got input, you got a perfect algorithm, and you got the perfect output. Almost all of computer science has tried to achieve the perfect question answering algorithm to get you the perfect answer. It was really hard for us to give up on that. And that's the real big breakthrough of the Watson system. We abandoned this invariant. And if you think about businesses, computer science, all the stuff today, all testing of all software relies on that invariant. But if you think about the old joke about experts, right? You ask 2 experts and you get 5 answers. That's exactly what we're doing here. We're generating a massive amount of possible answers. And then we go back and we test each and every one of these for evidence. On average, we generated about 600 possible answers per question during a Jeopardy game. That exploded into about 100,000 possible pieces of evidence we had to sort through, rank them, and generate an ordered list of possible answers. Now, there's a two-tier system. There were algorithms which look at that evidence, but there were also meta-algorithms which looked at the question, is this a joke? Is this a history question? Could this be sarcasm? And that influenced the ratings of all the evidence collecting parts of the system. So we gave up on this. There is one perfect algorithm. We're running hundreds of algorithms simultaneously and in sort through. One of the interesting episodes about that, the early versions of Watson had an answer panel with about 5 top answers. And then the Jeopardy guy said, well, that's kind of unfair because the humans only get to put up one answer. And so we put a version together which only had the top answer. And that turned out to be a really boring game. That just took away all the showmanship which Jeopardy folks were hoping for, so the answer panel came back on, and we limited it to the top 3. But that was actually part of the overall making it interesting as far as the TV show goes, portion of this. And now remember, you have to do this in 3 seconds. Right? So you've got to be there by the time the bell rings and this whole thing unlocks. We only got one tiny concession from the Jeopardy folks when we built this system. We were allowed to play by the deaf and blind rules of Jeopardy. That means no image hints and no audio hints. Which also explains why, to one of the questions, when Watson wasn't the first one to buzz in, and the first speaker got the answer wrong, we came up and put up the same wrong answer. Right? Because we couldn't listen in. We had people behind the scenes. We were allowed to learn between questions, but you had to actually enter the information by hand and relearn algorithmically there. So I couldn't actually hear the other contestants giving the wrong answer. As a human, even if you had that answer, you would obviously switch at that point. Well, what are you going to lose, right? You already know that that was wrong. So those are some of the trials and tribulations of having built that system. To give you a bit more of a detail of this, and I'm not sure whether you can read the question itself. It's in May 1898. Portugal celebrated the 400th anniversary of this explorer's arrival in India. I definitely need glasses. Now, you can parse all this, you can use all kinds of language, you recognize entities and stuff, and then you have a whole bunch of documents, possible answers, which you have to analyze. And this one's, in May, Gary arrived in India after he celebrated his anniversary in Portugal. And if you just do traditional keyword matching, this looks like a really, really good answer. Right? There's a bit of problem, as you all know, it was Vasco da Gama. So obviously that isn't the right answer. So you need a whole slew of stronger evidence, and you need to start to look at these documents, because the document which talks about Vasco da Gama says, on the 27th of May, 1498, Vasco da Gama landed in Kappa Beach. Doesn't have the word India in it. Doesn't have anything about an anniversary in it. So you need a whole slew of reasoning algorithms. Watson had temporal reasoning. It could analyze time. One of the things it knew about, and we heard this morning about, so it knew about time being linear. It didn't know about time being possibly finite and circular. It has a lot of statistical paraphrasing to get at some of these. And it had geographical reasoning. It could actually analyze things like names and countries and what's in what, and so on and so forth. It still is not 100% guarantee. It associates a certain amount of probability with this. So it does that with all the documents. And so that's how we managed to get there. What happened since? Obviously, there were a lot of people who say, well, IBM's international business machines, not international games machines. So what are you going to do about that? What do you do? We all always knew we weren't going to sell a question-answering game machine. Like the previous grand challenge we did was playing chess and beating a grandmaster at chess. We knew we weren't going to build chess computers. That was all about building super high-performing computers. This was really about unstructured information understanding. After we had that proof point that we actually can be good at it, we spent about 2 years in a pre-commercialization phase where we started to look at what areas could that Watson system be good at? Who could it help? Healthcare was the very first one. I know many of you probably know information explodes, and there's many statistics about this. In healthcare, published literature doubles about every 12 months. However, the amount of time a doctor has to read information per month is constant at about 3 to 4 hours. So there's no hope that they can possibly read all the newly published literature. What if you had a system which you could ask questions, which had absorbed all the literature and could tell you, here's the 3 most important pieces of information relevant to your current query? That was really one of the first systems we built in that space. We absorbed all the knowledge of the MSKCC, just forgot what that name stands for, the big cancer center in New York. Yes, exactly. So that was one of the first databases we absorbed. We started to look into many of these areas. And the second field we went into is financial services. As you in Australia particularly know, financial advice can be very challenging. And what if you had a system which actually could wade through all that information and give you maybe not better advice, but at least more honest advice about what's going on in that space? So we've worked with banks, we've worked with hospitals, we've worked with doctors for about 2 years. And then we started to build a whole new division in IBM to start marketing and selling products in this space. It's probably the fastest we ever went from a research prototype proof point to having a 3,000-person division, which is both producing, marketing, selling, maintaining, working with customers in this space. And this year we're starting to open it up to a much larger ecosystem. Through the academic initiative, we're starting to make available Watson systems to universities. Last year they started with 10 in the US. They've just announced that it's going to get expanded to 150 worldwide, 4 of which in Australia. It was a very, very interesting intellectual property twist. The classes get taught by the university. The students build little applications and get to learn these new kinds of computing, but the students own the intellectual property to their application. We think this is a very interesting move, and we hope that will generate a lot of smart ideas and incentives for students to build startups in that space, to really start opening up that. We started to look at very many areas. In Australia, you can look at a lot of the governments. They all talk about how interested they are to increase productivity, especially for small and medium businesses. If you look at some of their problems, a lot of the issues are around regulations. What is it I have to do? And then the search starts. You go and you try to figure out what are the regulations for whatever question you had. And often what the taxation office says, what the Chamber of Commerce says, etc., may be quite different. How do you know? And then you've got local and federal differences between that as well. What if you could train a Watson system and all of that, which would help you answer this. What if we could reduce the typically about half a day to a day time it takes a small business owner to research one of these questions? So let's say 2 hours. That would already be a significant improvement if we could find the relevant pieces of information. Longer term, that could completely change how information is published. Why try to build a really fancy website? Why not just dump it all out there and have a learning system go through and find the relevant information for you? So we see, over the next 50 years, a humongous amount of change coming towards us. We're just at the beginning of this new era of computing. So how does Watson learn? It's a bit similar to how humans learn. You start out as a baby, and then you first learn by interacting with your environment. You learn from your parents. You go to school. You start to learn from experts. You start to learn from experience until you're an expert yourself. Watson is pretty similar. When you start with a system, it knows nothing. It knows how to learn. But then you have to train it. It has to go through all of this. Yes, we have some pre-trained versions. The versions which we use for these academic initiatives, no Wikipedia. But what if you want to build a new one for your business or for your field of expertise? We have to start absorbing all that knowledge. So actually, these classes the students learn, the first part of the class is all about information curation. And how do you prepare the information, and how do you get it into the system so it learns about it? And the second part is the application, which has question-answering portions to that. So somewhat cynical, this looks a bit like that, right? Like any of these systems, since you start out somewhere early, there's some phases in the middle which may be a little confusing. There may be some angry moments where, but I told you, this isn't the answer. So there's a lot of that going on currently as we're trying to train these systems. Now you can start to imagine how courageous I think our leadership in IBM is to bet our business on this going forward. So that's what we're doing. We're betting on this cognitive computing to carry us through the next 50 years. There's still going to be a lot of traditional computing going on. Still going to be needed. The Watson system currently cannot process images. We're working on that. So if we think about the capabilities of such a system, at the lowest level, it's all about assistance, leveraging encyclopedic domain knowledge. This is where most systems are at today. They only have little bits of reasoning. They only know very few things. There's still a lot of technology, research, which needs to go into much deeper understanding. You just saw the tip of the iceberg with that Vasco da Gama, a little bit of temporal and a little bit of geographical reasoning in it. There's a lot more which needs to go in. Watson currently can't do math, can't read formulas. That still all needs to go in. One of the things we're working on in our lab is how do we start to analyze medical images? Think about a medical doctor. It's not just about the medical written records. There's a lot of lab tests. There's a lot of images which need to be analyzed. Today there's cameras the size of a pill which you can swallow, and they take about somewhere around 80,000 pictures while they travel through your body. How do you find the few things which are medically relevant? It is very tiring. A human can only stay alert for about 20 minutes watching images before their efficiency drops to 50%. Now multiply that by 80,000 pictures and it's going to take you very long. Even just reducing the amount of time it takes to say, here are the 3 images you ought to look at. Here are the most relevant to your current query to actually look at. Or think about maintenance manual of a car or an airplane. They all have pictures in it. Starting to learn all of that. So that's a current area of research in this space. Decision making. How to provide bias-free advice. In the research lab, we look at healthcare, disaster management, and natural resource management as industry areas. Whether you're advising a doctor in diagnosis or an emergency management person about an evacuation, you want to know the consequences. What if I decide to evacuate this area to this area over here? Well, the projected path of the fire will take out your electrical station, which serves the area you're just moving the people in. That might not be a good move. Or you're moving the people into the path of the projected fire. You want to know the consequences of decisions. And those who read the very first slide, this is kind of the overall research mission of the research lab here in Melbourne. We're looking at the consequences of decisions in all of these fields, in bringing all of that together. And then the next step beyond that is discovery. Create new insights from the information you have. The current system of Watson can tell you what somebody else said if it can find it in the information. It can't currently create new insights. That's the highest step we currently can think about. And I'm sure as we're going down the road, there's going to be other areas we're thinking about. We're also not thinking of there will be just one big supercomputer which can answer your questions. We think of this as a society of cognitive agents. Some simple ones we're building here locally are around this disaster management. We take very high precision weather models, feed them into a fire model so we can calculate the spread, overlay that onto a map of an area so we can then model how long will it take to evacuate. We can model all kinds of stuff in that area. What's the closest people will get to the fire? Now, a lot of these models obviously are not that easy to build because you can't just go and burn down the Dandenongs and measure, right? So, like many of these models, you have to ask a lot of subject matter experts, and some of these things are very contentious. When we built the first model for the Dandenongs in Melbourne, we came up with it takes about 4 hours to get everybody out. And the firefighters go, yeah, this is the first scientific proof we have that we're right that it takes 4 hours. Right? Next thing you hear is one of the people from the Dandenong says, this is all bullshit. I commute every day. I know it only takes 15 minutes to get out. Right? So obviously there's quite a bit of contention of what's the right number. The other problem with all of this was when we compared this to fire spread models, which we worked together with the University of Melbourne. Irregardless of where you start the fire, it takes 3 hours to burn down the Dandenongs. The evacuation model says if everybody goes when the government says go, nobody makes another accident, everybody behaves nicely, it takes 4 hours to get everybody out. So you see the problem, right? You've got -1 hour to decide to evacuate. And some of these things are hard. We heard police officers who had been sent to evacuate places, and I said, well, it's really hard because we were arguing with this person while you saw the fire on the horizon, right? That they were looking at their cell phone and saying, the fire's not here yet, I'm not leaving. And so there's a lot of questions around all of these. And when we're talking about consequences, it's not just getting the models right. The human behavior models involved in all of these are actually the most unpredictable. And I think we heard that in the talk before. One of my funnest experience was some researchers at MIT were trying to build an image classifier, and they had crowdsourced people annotating and tagging images. And I was in a session like this, sitting beside a guy who was one of the crowdsourced people tagging images. And there was an image of an ocean with boats on it. And so, guess what he did as tagging? Votes are here to hold down the ocean. Right? And so you start to wonder, how many of those did they get in their classifier? So some of these things can obviously be very, very difficult to distinguish between what was a humorous comment, what's actually right. And you could probably argue that boats hold down the ocean to some extent, but it seems to be awfully far-fetched. So that's, to a large extent, where we are at with this kind of research. Now, I'm going to show you, going forward, one of the next grand challenges. And this is the first time ever I've heard us talk about a grand challenge before we actually managed to do it. But since our boss, John Kelly, showed that earlier in the year publicly, and you can find the video clip I'm going to play you on the internet, I thought I might play it as well. This is one of the next versions of the Watson system we're working at. And it's a debater system. It gives you pros and cons for an argument. So.
Now I'd like to show you a third capability which we've never shown before outside of our research labs. And this will give you a hint and a sense for where Watson is going in the future. The real question is, can a computer not just answer complex questions with simple answers, and not just take massive amounts of genomic data and come up with better treatments for cancer, but can a computer take raw information and digest and reason on that information and understand the context? So one of the prototype systems that we're building is something we call the debater. We give it freewheeling understanding of large bodies of information like Wikipedia, and we ask the computer, with no human intervention, construct arguments, pro and con, on any subject we throw at it. And the result of that is what I'd like to show in the demonstration now. If we could roll the video, please.
Hello, and welcome to the IBM Debating Technologies demonstration. Today we shall focus on detecting relevant claims. To proceed, please select the topic, and I will share with you my top predictions for pro claims and con claims.
So as I said, we can throw any subject at it. I've chosen some here, and let's just pick the first one. So it will now look for all the literature and try to understand, as a computer, what's a pro and what's a con for violent video games. Let's roll the first one.
Scanned approximately 4 million Wikipedia articles, returning 10 most relevant articles. Scanned all 3,000 sentences in top 10 articles. Detected sentences which contain candidate claims. Identified borders of candidate claims. Assessed pro and con polarity of candidate claims. Constructed demo speech with top claim predictions. Ready to deliver. You have selected the topic. The sale of violent video games to minors should be banned. I would like to raise the following points in support of the topic. Exposure to violent video games results in increased physiological arousal, aggression-related thoughts and feelings, as well as decreased prosocial behavior. In addition, these violent games or lyrics actually cause adolescents to commit acts of real-life aggression. Finally, violent video games can increase children's aggression. On the other hand, I would like to note the following claims that oppose the topic. Violence in video games is not causally linked with aggressive tendencies. In addition, most children who play violent games do not have problems. Finally, video game play is part of an adolescent boy's normal social setting. Would you like to discuss another topic?
So as you can see,
I'm sorry about losing the sync on the video versus the audio feed, but I hope you got the audio feed, because it was mostly audio anyway. To give you a bit of an idea where this is going. So, let me summarize. We built a whole new computing system. We think it's a new era of computing, computers which learn. They will be completely different. They're breaking the old one-on-one relationship we know from computer science. They run hundreds of algorithms simultaneously and give you probabilistic answers. still a human at the end which actually has to make a choice between all these answers as what to do going forward. But we're beyond just basic lookup, as you see in the labs. We're starting to have both image analytic stuff starting to feed into it, as well as a lot of sense making, with the Debater being one of these projects.
Fantastic question. Him in the back.
So on the search side, Google is still strictly a lookup of keywords in that part. So the whole sense making and evidence finding and compressing this down to the top 3, 4, 5 results is the key part of this system. Right? With Google, at least for most of the searches I do, I still get 1 million results, of which I'm looking at the first couple anyway. But it's that whole sense-making, understanding, and reasoning which is part of the system. Yes? Right. So for the first part about more harm, this is always a question of how it's used. For a while, I studied decisions of school boards, and they always assume new technology is bad. History has always shown that while we have some bad uses, we always have good uses, and we often free up our brain to do more creative things going forward. As far as the quantum side, there's obviously a lot of research in that space, and we think that will be one of many possible algorithms and machines being integrated. We're currently, so we're investing ourselves a lot into quantum computing. Closer in is low energy computing. We're building a new chip called Synapse, which is working more like the brain. One of the biggest issues with the Jeopardy system is power consumption. It still uses, guesstimated, about 10,000 times more energy than our brain. So even if we could build a computer where everybody in the world could ask a question at the same time, we wouldn't have enough energy in the world to run such a computer. We currently have a simulator for that Synapse chip, which runs in real time on the Los Alamos 96 rack blue gene. So think about how that will change the equation as we're going forward. That will probably happen before the quantum computers will be ready.
Yes, one here. Yes.
Yes. I used to manage a user interface group when I was still in Watson. And one of our key sentences was, you can't build a foolproof system because fools are so ingenious. One of the biggest challenges we have with the Watson systems currently is not enough knowledge. So most of the systems underperform currently because the customer we're working with has only very few subject matter expert knowledge. You can't take an FAQ with 500 answers and expect to build a trained Watson system with it. It typically needs thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of documents to get good at. So in most cases, our biggest challenge is not enough machine learnable knowledge being available in building these systems, right? And then my personal cynical view is, think about this, we're looking at a 2-year-old here, right? So wait until it gets into the teenager years.
Just one more question. Yes, yeah.
Yes. So when we looked at new labs, we looked at two things. One was economic growth, and clearly we were shifting from the mature countries, as IBM calls it, to the growth markets. In Australia qualified. The other thing we looked for is a good academic environment. And all our new labs are located kind of at intersection points between industry and academia. So physically, we're actually kind of between RMIT and University of Melbourne, just 2 blocks north of the CBD in Melbourne. In Australia has obviously a great scientific history. The knowledge here is great. Melbourne in particularly has a lot of medical parts, so that part we're very well embedded. That was one of the reasons to come here. And so, yes, I know you sometimes feel a little bit at the end of the world. You could also say you're at the center of the world. Everybody else is just at the edges.
So thank you very good. Work better. We all can work and improve from mistakes, and we don't want you to make a mistake. So the book I've chosen for you is Brilliant Blunders.
Thank you.
Now, I promised a challenge for you, and I went to Germany about 10 years ago when my son was 6. 10 years ago. Yeah, that's right. He wasn't for that one. And I bought this mechanical thing, and even though I've got the cheat sheet here, I've never been able to undo it. Yeah. So I'll leave that with you, and